Hello, everybody, and welcome to Section 3 of Chapter 13. We are going to be discussing due process. Again, hopefully, this is a review. And more specifically, we're going to be looking at procedural due process and substantive due process. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. The 14th Amendment is known as the Due Process Clause because it guarantees the due process of law. Okay, so this guarantees the equal protection of the laws, and the reason why this comes to procedural due process and substantive due process is because in order for things to be fair and to be equal, the laws themselves need to be equal or fair, right? So there can't be anything discriminatory in the laws themselves, which is substantive due process, and the way that the laws are applied and the procedures that are followed need to be done so fairly and equally. And this is the procedural due process, all right? So as we continue our lecture today, I want you guys to remember back to our lecture where we discussed this as well as incorporation, okay? So feel free to review past lectures. But continuing on today, we're going to be looking at how these things were kind of fleshed out by different Supreme Court cases. All right, guys? So let's get started. I'm going to try to keep this quicker than the other videos. Let's see if I can do that. So here is just two images taken from the text from page 417. And I put them up close side by side so that if, on the exam you want to go back and refer to this, you can. But basically, we're going to go through this lecture and discuss these things a little bit closer, okay? So, as we know, the Constitution does not create rights or grant any rights. Instead, it protects and guarantees unalienable rights that are referred to in the Declaration of Independence, okay? There's many rights that we as citizens of this nation have that are not stated within the Bill of Rights or the Constitution, and they are known as unenumerated rights. Okay, so the Supreme Court has used the doctrine of substantive due process to decide what some of these rights are, including property rights, the right to travel, the right to process, the right to personal autonomy, and the right to personal dignity. Okay, so question 12 on the quiz is a true or false question, and the answer to number 12 is true. The Supreme Court has used the doctrine of substantive due process to protect unenumerated rights, such as the right to privacy and to travel. Okay? So now that I've mentioned that, let us continue on. Alrighty? Okay. So when it comes to substantive due process and unenumerated rights, okay, the Ninth Amendment says that rights that are not explicitly stated within the Bill of Rights are protected. Okay, so let's continue on and look at some really interesting court cases. Okay, a really famous case is known as the Bake Shop case. In 1895, New York legislature passed the Bake Shop Act, and basically the premise was they felt that it was unhealthy to be working too long within a bakery with all the flour and particles in the air. They felt that it was not healthy for workers to be overworked. And so the law limited workers to working no more than 10 hours a day or 60 hours a week. Okay? So what ended up happening was that one baker or a company did not follow these laws, and they were the owner, Joseph Lochner, was arrested because he required this employee to be working more than this law claimed. So, long story short, the case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and in a 5-4 decision, the justices agreed with Lochner that it was not okay for the state legislature to deem certain work hours okay for some trades and not others, okay? They overturned his conviction and they ruled the act unconstitutional. And so the idea was the court ruled that New York law was unconstitutional because it was an illegal interference with the rights of individuals, both employers and employees, to make contracts regarding labor upon such terms as they may think the best. So that's a long, complicated way of saying that the court did not believe that working long hours in a bakery was unhealthy. Okay? And so Justices John Marshall and Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote dissent. They did not agree with the court's decision. They argued that the court's majority should have respected the legislature's judgment instead of following their own points of view on the issue. And so this case had quite a huge effect. So I actually already went over this. I'm going to continue on. First, criticisms of substantive due process were heard as a response to this. Critics attacked the courts for using the doctrine to impose its own views and values on the nation. And as the court continued to apply substantive due process to laws that affected property rights, criticism grew. So remember that substantive due process, okay, is looking at the laws themselves and seeing that, is this fair or is it not fair? So they felt that this Bake Shop Act was not fair because it was limiting only one trade. It wasn't fair or equitable. It wasn't limiting hours of work in all trades, in all companies. It was specifically just for bakers. Okay? And so that was part of the problem with this case, all right? So the courts continued to debate this issue over and over. So finally, in the United States versus Caroline Products Company in 1938, the court announced that it would apply only a rational basis test to economic regulations. And if you remember, the rational basis test is the lowest level of scrutiny that is applied. It's the least strict standard that you can apply for a law to be upheld. So they realized that perhaps they were applying too strict of scrutiny to these laws, and in order to make decisions going forward, okay, they would need to lower the threshold. And so the practical result of this, okay, so the result of limiting it to just the rational basis test was that it nearly stopped applying substantive due process to property rights. Okay? But they did say they would continue to apply a stricter test to laws that affect personal rights. And that leads us into discussing protecting personal rights. All right. So after Caroline, the court did begin to use substantive due process to define basic personal rights. All right. Now, this is a really complicated way of saying that after this court decision in 1938, the court decided to evaluate the substance of laws to decide if laws were fair when it comes to personal rights. Okay, that's what substantive due process is. So one of the first challenges in this way was in Griswold v. Connecticut. Okay, so at the time it was illegal for people to, I should be specific, in Connecticut it was illegal for individuals to use contraceptive devices, methods of preventing pregnancy. And so what ended up happening was a married couple were found to be in possession of these birth control devices, and they got in trouble. Long story short, the case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and it was decided that people's privacy was being violated by this law. Okay, and so in a continuation of this right to privacy, Roe v. Wade was decided. Okay, so as some of you may already know, Roe v. Wade was the landmark Supreme Court decision that made it legal for women to choose to have abortions. And initially at this time, it was an expansion on right to privacy. Although now, when people are discussing and debating abortion, it is no longer linked to the right to privacy. So, to continue our discussion of personal rights, another one that is challenged is the right to die, which sounds kind of crazy, like, oh, a right to die? Why would that be a right? This was challenged in a case in 1983 where a woman was critically injured in a car accident, and she basically became she was so injured that she was stuck in a permanent vegetative state, right? So she was, for all intents and purposes, brain dead. So doctors said she would never recover, and her parents requested to remove her feeding tube so that she could die. All right. The hospital said they would not do this. They would not remove the feeding tube, and so the family took the hospital to court. All right. They took the hospital to court, and the court ruled that the right to refuse medical treatment was a privacy right protected by the 14th Amendment. So it is your right to refuse treatment, and it is your right to die. At the same time, however, it decided that in this case, the parents did not have enough evidence to support that this is what their daughter would have wanted. So they, in this Supreme Court decision, although they sort of found in favor of the idea that the family was fighting for, they didn't actually find in favor of this family. So just so you know how it ends, the parents were actually able to come back to court with evidence of conversations the daughter had with friends. They did remove the daughter's feeding tube, and the daughter did pass on. But this was a huge decision. So the effects was that the courts established a patient's right to die, to refuse medical treatment and to die. And it set up a due process standard by which someone else could make a decision if a patient is unable to do so. All right. So now we're going to be looking at procedural due process. And if you remember, substantive due process is looking at the substance of the laws, right? Procedural due process is looking at the procedures and the way that laws are applied, right? So your text has two cases to kind of talk about different aspects of this case. When it comes to Goldberg v. Kelly, John Kelly and other New York residents were receiving financial assistance, okay? It challenged the constitutionality of procedures for termination of their aid. They basically were having their aid terminated, their medical support terminated, and they felt that it violated their right to due process because there was no hearing before their assistance was terminated, and they felt that they had the right to be told that this was going to happen and to fight it before it happened. Okay, and so the decision was in their favor. It changed the way that all government payments, such as disability benefits or pensions, were administered. Before this case, payments were looked at as a form of charity or privilege. But after this case, the court recognized that aid payments were a form of property. And so the court said that the government could not deprive people of this kind of property without due process of law. Remember the right to life, liberty, and property? So a second case, which kind of blows my mind, is actually the unwed father case, Stanley v. Illinois. So at the time in Illinois, a parent was defined by Illinois state law as a man or woman who had a child that were married, or a woman who had a child who wasn't married. Under Illinois state law, a man who wasn't married and fathered a child was not considered a parent. So there was a man and a woman who had children together, and the woman died. Now, because they were not married, the state took the man's children away. And he took the case to court and he said that this is not okay. There was no hearing. I didn't have even the opportunity to fight to keep my children. There was nothing done to prove that my home was not okay, that was not safe, right? And so he argued that his right to due process was violated. So he sued the state to regain custody of his children. All right. And by a 5-2 vote, the Supreme Court agreed with Stanley's argument, and they held that unwed fathers are entitled to due process hearings just like married fathers and unwed mothers to determine their fitness as a parent before the children can be declared wards of the state. So this case is important even beyond the area of family law. It established what the Constitution requires in the way of due process for any person. Okay? The court said that before government at any level can deprive a person of rights or property, the person must at least be given formal notice and a hearing to meet requirements of procedural fairness. We're almost done, guys. Good job for hanging on. Procedural due process and juvenile justice. So this is pretty interesting. It's a story that is kind of mind-blowing. So a background to this case, it's the case is from 1967, and it is the In re Gault case. The mother of a 15-year-old came home from work and found that her son was missing. She discovered that he was taken into custody by the sheriff. A woman said she had received a lewd phone call, and she felt that it was this young boy who made the disgusting phone call. So he was arrested. The mother was not informed of what was going on. They were not told that they could have lawyers. The case was heard by a judge. It wasn't a formal trial that was held at the time. It was not felt that children, like juvenile delinquents, had a right or the same, I shouldn't say right, the same need for a full trial as adults do. And so nothing was written down. The child never had the right to speak. The mother never had the right to speak. There was no jury. And the judge simply made a decision to send this child to prison until he was 21 years old. All right. And under Arizona law, the child had no right to appeal his conviction or punishment. So his parents took the case to the Supreme Court, demanding that he be released. Basically, his lawyers claimed that Arizona violated his Fourth Amendment protection of due process. And they argued that minors should also have the same rights as adults in judicial procedures. In an 8-1 decision, the justices rejected the state's argument and found in favor of the child. Quote, neither the 14th Amendment nor the Bill of Rights is for adults alone, is what they said. Continuing, under our Constitution, the condition of being a boy does not justify a kangaroo court. Side note, if you're wondering what a kangaroo court is, it's sort of like a farce of a court where there's no real rules, no real procedure. It's almost like a joke of a court. And so what they were essentially saying is that, when an adult is tried, they have all of these rights, but when a juvenile is tried, suddenly they lose their rights, and the court is set up in such a way that it's really unfair. So there was quite a big impact as a result to this decision. So basically, It gave juveniles most of the same due process rights as adults. Um, they decided that juveniles had the right to know what they are charged with. They have the right to counsel, which is the same thing as saying they have a right to a lawyer to defend them. They also have a right to confront witnesses. Um, they're not given the same rights in every case. In most states, juveniles still do not have the right to a trial by jury. But for the most part, children are entitled to the same rights as adults. So looking at the quiz, question number 11, the Due Process Clause is part of the Fourth Amendment. Guys, this is false. It is part of the 14th Amendment. So question 11, the answer is false. Question 12, we said it was true. The Supreme Court has used the doctrine of substantive due process to protect unenumerated rights. And then last for this section, question 13. The most important result of the In re Gault decision was that it stated that juveniles are entitled to the same due process rights as adults. This is true. So 11, false, 12, true, 13, true. Okay? So that brings us to the end of this lecture. Thank you for bearing with me. Have a good evening, and I look forward to sharing the next video with you.